as economists, we have a shared background because Sara has also been at VTI. And we have worked on trying to provide inputs to get economic analysis into policy making in Sweden in different areas. I work in environmental economics. We have found that in certain areas the interest is rather low. So the reason for this paper is why this is the case, mainly. And one reason could be that politicians and policymakers think we are applying RIA, the full RIA process in Sweden, but we've seen that we are not. Hence the possible role of RIA in Swedish transport planning. And this is a paper that is maybe in the area of Oliver, so he can comment if I have some theory that he doesn't, that might not be correct. But the purpose of the paper was to describe the present use of RIA and CBA in the Swedish planning context. Also the consequences of current practices, and we use the Swedish transport regulator as a case study. And based on the findings, we give recommendations for institutional changes that we think are needed if the full RIA process is to be implemented in Swedish transport policy and planning. And that also involves, Sweden has a rather fragmented governance system, so it's difficult to get this at all levels, up to those working with negotiations at the EU level. So it's quite a lot of maybe logistics or coordination. And for that, you probably need a better structure. So the background comes mainly from political science and other social sciences. It is stated that the full RIA process is not implemented in Sweden. OECD has said it, but also Radelli in a paper or several. And the OECD is saying that this is a tool to achieve good governance, and that the idea is that we get can look at policy making and regulation, different aspects, how it will affect society in different ways. And RIA, as I see it, is both a structure. It's a structure for policy making. We do it in a certain order. We should cover certain consequences, but it's also a decision process. So it's a way to get stakeholders involved in a systematic way in doing regulations. And the origin, as far as I know, comes from the US in 1981 and Reagan, and was adopted in the EU in 2002, and now is part of the work with better regulation. But this started, and this is interesting for the Swedish case, it was a focus on administrative simplification also. And if you look in the literature, you can see that the actual application varies between countries. It is also said that this is not straightforward and may be controversial. And I think it's a German researcher who has said that economic analysis in general is difficult to reconcile with systems of negotiated policy making in consensus democracies, and that is characterizing Sweden. And if you look at sort of the theory behind RIA, the use of cost-benefit analysis and regulatory governance, which is a research area, I would say that microeconomic theory is one basis for the discussion on regulatory policy and design of policy instruments. And Shapiro has said that when RIA was introduced, it was accepted. There was one question, should you control the agencies? But that was okay. Politicians were right to control agencies. But the use and the role of economic analysis, and especially CBA, was much more debated. And there has also been changes in the ordinances or the laws regarding this. So they have changed, for example, coming from exceed cost to justify cost. So sort of broadening the concept. I also found, and this is from the political science literature, I think, that there has been a divide between political scientists. Some only look at the welfare state, and here it's more about redistribution of resources. And others have looked more at the regulatory state. How do we work in agencies? How do we design regulations, etc.? And the welfare state is more European tradition, while the regulatory state is the US. And according to Levy 4, this has also sort of been a conflict among researchers, this difference, which has now resulted in a separate or a new field of research called regulatory governance. And here I want to stress that regulation have different meanings in different contexts. So many of you are working with competition, and we think about regulation of regulating a market. But in the work with the Swedish Transport Agency, they work on a much broader scale with different regulations of different kinds. So one has to separate regulation looking at the market and regulation in a broader sense. And that may mean, and what Sara and I have been discussing, is that you might need to sort of make a clearer definition of what you think CBA is. CBA is often used as a concept, but is it just a calculation coming to the net present value, or is it also a tool to design policy instruments and discuss different types of regulations? If we go to Sweden then, we have a not traditional setup of our government system. We have ministries that employ few % of the civil servants. They are rather small. And we have instead quite large semi-autonomous government agencies. And when we prepare laws, we have by tradition had committees of inquiry and referral processes to develop the laws. And here's different, it's policymakers, but it's also other stakeholders that come together, sit in an inquiry and sort of weigh the pros and cons, and therefore get this kind of rationalistic decision making. This have changed somewhat since we entered the EU in 1995. And this is discussed by a social scientist called Pettersson. So government agencies have a stronger role now because decision making is faster. So you do negotiations between the EU and the ministries, and the ministries get help from the agencies. So we don't always have this traditional process with committees of inquiry. Something also happened in the end of the 1990s. We had a social democratic government. We had influences of new public management. So we got the Vision Zero and environmental quality objectives. And these are not based on cost-benefit analysis. So they are ambitious goals that also guide transport policy and planning. And then we got a change of government in 2006, a new center-right government, Alliansen. They had a business focus, and they also made organizational changes in the governance system. So they created 2 new administrations or agencies in the transport area, or rather 3. It was the Swedish Transport Administration, where you merged the road and the rail administrator. I think that was because you wanted to get a better grip on multimodality. It's also related, I think, to the environmental quality objectives. So the idea was that if we merge and we can combine the competences, then we will also sort of develop a system that is more environmental friendly. In addition, because this was the work by Alliansen, it was also a way to reduce costs for public administrations. So I think that was 2 objectives. And related to that, then, they also needed to merge the regulators, because there were a number of regulators for the rail market and for the road market. So there was a new agency created, the Swedish Transport Agency, which Sara and Mats represents. And then we also got an analysis agency who is doing analysis in the transport area. So if we look more closely on how CBA is used in Swedish transport planning, it's been used since the 1960s for investments. We also have it in the overriding goal for transport policy, which is to ensure economic efficiency and long-term sustainability of transport provision for citizens and enterprises throughout Sweden. At the same time that we got the environmental quality objectives and the Vision Zero, there was also a group started that looked into the principles and the inputs to cost-benefit analysis in Swedish transport planning. This group was headed by the then separate agency SIKA, and it was composed of researchers for transport agencies at the time, SIKA, and also Swedish EPA. But then, when this reorganization was made in 2010, this group, ASEC, was moved to the Swedish Transport Administration, which has a focus on infrastructure investment. So it's not a separate agency anymore. It belongs to one of the agencies working with transport planning. And there has been much discussion in Sweden about how to achieve a sustainable transport system. So therefore, the Swedish Transport Administration has developed the so-called 4-step principle, which is an idea or a systematic way to start thinking about, can we influence demand for travel in other ways than building new roads? That's the basic. So sustainability, as you see from the overall goal, is sort of influencing transport planning in very many ways. As for the Swedish EPA and economic analysis in relation to the environmental quality objectives, that was not introduced until 2010. When we come to RIA, this was implemented there was a new ordinance in 2007 that actually started to be developed in 1995. So we have long decision processes in Sweden. This was adopted by Alliansen, the new government, center-right. It's only relevant for regulatory agencies, so not in general should we do CBA or RIA, but just when we do regulations. And 3 of the more important paragraphs are number 6, which is on general RIA practices, paragraph 7 on the influence on business, and paragraph 10 on ex post analysis, and the latter is rather, it's never used. The agency responsible for implementing this ordinance is the Swedish Agency for Economic and Regional Growth, and they should take help from the National Management Authority. So this agency, this is opposite to what the recommendation was from the public inquiry. They said we should have autonomous agency working on how to implement RIA. So it should be Swedish National Management Authority responsible with the help regarding business from the Swedish Agency for Economic and Regional Growth. But this government, with the focus on business, turned things around. They also introduced a better regulation council to make controls of the RIAs that are done. And I would say that they have a focus on administrative simplification. So it's not on competition policy. And it was not until 2015 that the Swedish National Management Authority introduced a guideline on how to do CBA. So it's quite recently that we got information about that.
So I'm going to talk about the Swedish Transport Agency and what we do in terms of regulatory impact assessment and cost-benefit analysis. And I'm also going to introduce you and talk very short about the case study that me and Lena did at the agency this spring, where we kind of evaluated all the RIAs with CBA that we have done the past few years. So we are the Swedish transport regulator, and we regulate all transport, that is rail, shipping, and aviation and road. So we were established in January 1st, 2009, part of this big reorganization that Lena was talking about. So we are a merger of several different agencies, and you can read more about that in the paper. Currently, we are about 1,800 co-workers, and the overall responsibility is to design rules and to make sure that the society abide by them. And we have currently about 469 rules that we are responsible for. And this is, well, I'm not a law expert here, so you have to bear with me. I'm not good with the terminology. But it's kind of these base regulations where we have the authority to provide a new rule or change an existing one. So if we include the amending regulation and suspending provisions, we have many, many more. And we have to perform RIAs when we design a new rule or when we change an existing rule. And also when we do government commissions and when we propose a change to different types of regulations. So every time the proposal is a rule, we have to do this RIA according to the RIA ordinance. And it's rather detailed in what should be included in the analysis. We do about 50 RIAs per year, more or less. And we introduced cost-benefit analysis in 2013, so it's rather late. In terms of employing 4 economists with the explicit task of implementing cost-benefit analysis in the agency. And we also introduced CBA in the in-house guideline on how to perform and when to perform a RIA, and also in the template, and in the in-house education. And the first RIAs, including cost-benefit analysis, were performed in 2014, in the spring. And this was kind of supported by the documents of guidelines and templates. And in some cases, one of the economists assisted the RIA. So you have to remember that those who perform these RIAs are not economists. They are experts in other areas. So this is important to remember for the results. So turning to the case study, so me and Lena evaluated the changes of introducing cost-benefit analysis in the agency. So the aim was to analyze the RIAs made since cost-benefit analysis was introduced via this new template and guideline. And the time period is spring 2014 until January this year. So we basically used the scorecard method by Hahn and Dudley and adjusted it to our context. So it means that we checked if certain information was included in the RIA. We did not evaluate if it was the right information, just whether or not it was included. So you can read more about the method in the paper. And we also considered the Swedish context, especially the RIA ordinance and how it's designed. And we also included the transport policy goals, at least partially, since only the sub-targets are included in the in-house guideline. The overarching goal of economic efficiency and sustainability is not included. And furthermore, the environmental quality objectives and the Vision Zero is not included, even though we as an agency have to strive for them. So the context or the framework is agency guidelines and routines. So this is a framework for how and when to produce a RIA. We have about 1 up to 22 changes made per RIA. So we treated each change as one observation. And so the total number of observations is 142. And we saw that the clarity of presentation is somewhat difficult the more changes you include per RIA. So it's more difficult to follow the RIA. And we have a large variety of the questions addressed in our RIAs. And we design rules in many different areas in all transport. And of course, that affects society in different ways. So some examples from our sample is medical requirements and requirement for traffic safety, environmental effects, and so on. So these are just a few examples. Turning to the results, here they are in sum. So the first column is basically the analytical steps of a RIA. And the second column is just the qualitative description of the assessment. And 3 and 4 are whether or not we have been able to quantify or put a monetary value on the effect. And the little star is that we have chosen to describe these results in another way than in this table. For enterprises, for instance, we have to calculate the monetary valuation in several different ways due to the RIA ordinance. So we did not include this in this table, so it's in a separate table. And the little minus or the little line is just that you don't have to do this according to the in-house guidelines. So therefore, we did not include this in the analysis. And as you can see, the concerned parties are kind of evenly distributed. So many parts of the society are affected by our rules. But there are very few cases where we have been able to quantify or put a monetary value on the effect, except for enterprises. And it's a rather high number for the monetary valuation as well. I don't have a slide for it, so you just have to trust me. But it's a rather high number. And what's also interesting, if you look at alternatives to no regulation, is that this is only investigated in 10% of the cases. And one explanation might be, which we did not investigate any further, is that many of the proposals come from the EU, and the decision has already been made. So it's more or less we have to package the proposal. But the number is rather low because we have acting space in many different areas. So the main results, very, very brief. As you saw, there are few cases where the effects of the proposals made have been quantified or given a monetary value in terms of a benefit or a cost, except for enterprises. And we also found that the RIAs are often produced after the policy decision has been made. And this implies that it serves more to justify a regulatory decision than to inform it. So as I said, several of the regulations come from the EU. So this is more or less what you need to do. You need to put a packaging on the proposal. But when you have acting space, you really need to consider your options. It's very, very important. So acting space is a key issue here. And also you need to apply the analysis in the negotiation phase. It might be another type of analysis that is required more or less when coming to the end, when implementing a proposal. So a potential risk with a too strong focus on enterprises is that you forget to assess other relevant social effect. And then it doesn't matter if you do a great cost-benefit analysis in the end if you forget to remember other social groups in the beginning. So there are some explanations that we believe are possible to our results. And the first is the RIA ordinance and how it's designed. It's designed for the proposal to be a rule. And this is fine when the proposal is going to be a rule, but when you have an acting space, you need to consider the options. So one risk is that you end up doing a rule or designing a rule even though another instrument could have worked just as fine. And also the only external scrutiny that is made of our RIAs is performed by the Better Regulation Council. And according to their instructions, they are going to mitigate the possible negative effects of regulations. So it's nothing strange, really, that we have a really big focus on enterprises in Sweden. So the current focus on cost-benefit analysis and transport is an infrastructure investment, as Lena said. So input to this kind of analysis has been developed ever since the 1960s, and the focus is on net present values. And it's not sure that you can just transfer these inputs to a regulatory context. So this is the focus both in research and in practice. And as I said before, there is a great variety of the questions addressed in our RIAs, both in short term and in long term. So there are often very complex situations that we are assessing, and there are great uncertainties to be handled, and often the situations might be less standardized compared to an investment decision. So all of this makes it more difficult and more costly to produce a cost-benefit analysis of the proposal. So turning to the conclusions, maybe you want to have the word again?
Yeah. Sort of to sum up first, the Swedish governance system is highly fragmented, and we have a division of responsibilities that is unclear. It's also so that policy making is faster today, which has led to a more important role for government agencies in regulatory preparations. But the problem, as economists, we see, is that we have no demand for RIA at the political level, at least not the full RIA process. But the institutional design that we're working is developed by the politicians. And also, in the areas where there is RIA or CBA, it's by agencies with an interest in a certain area. So that could also guide, like for instance, currently in investment analysis and the Swedish Transport Administration, they have a focus on developing inputs that are relevant for their agencies and not for society overall or for the regulatory agency. So it's difficult for a single agency to implement the full RIA process when they depend on others for relevant inputs. So our recommendations, based on our findings, is that the RIA ordinance needs to be revised. There needs to be a shift of focus away from regulation and to provide incentives for assessment of different types of policy instruments, like economic instruments, for example. it also needs to be clarified that this is an independent policy-making tool, so it's not connected to certain areas. Because in the literature, it's also talked about economic literacy, that policymakers in different areas understand economics. And if you just have a focus on regulators and certain policy areas, you won't have that general knowledge in the government system. We also think that the Better Regulation Council needs a wider role, looking more at organization and competition policy and not just simplification of administration. And then it's the role of this group ASEC. We think they should maybe also be separated from the Swedish Transport Administration. Thank you.